How to Train Your Dragon is a live-action reimagining of the beloved 2010 DreamWorks animated classic, and it stands as a landmark release because it is the very first film in DreamWorks Animation's history to receive a full live-action adaptation. The movie was produced by DreamWorks Animation and Mark Platt Productions, and it was distributed worldwide by Universal Pictures, the studio that has handled DreamWorks releases for years. What makes this project especially significant is that it was not handed over to an outside director looking to put a fresh spin on someone else's story. Instead, Dean DeBois, the very same filmmaker who co-directed the original animated trilogy alongside Chris Sanders, returned to write and direct this live-action version himself. This made the project the first time in the modern wave of animated to live-action remakes that the original creative mind behind the story was brought back to reinterpret his own work, rather than a new director being assigned to a beloved franchise. The film is based on the How to Train Your Dragon book series written by British author Cressida Cowell, which originally inspired the animated universe, though the movie itself follows the plot and tone of the 2010 animated film far more closely than the books. The project was officially announced in February 2023, and from the very beginning DeBois made it clear that his goal was not to reinvent the story but to deepen it, enrich the characters, expand the mythology, and give audiences a more immersive and visceral version of a tale that already worked beautifully in animated form. He explained in press interviews that because the original narrative was already so strong, the pieces of the story were designed to slot naturally into a live-action frame without needing to be rewritten from scratch. Composer John Powell, who scored all 3 animated films and whose music became inseparable from the emotional identity of the franchise, returned once again to compose the score for this live-action version, ensuring that the sound of Burke and the flight sequences with Toothless would carry the same emotional weight audiences remembered from the animated films. The story takes place on the rugged Viking island of Burke, a windswept and stormy village where the people have lived in a state of constant warfare with dragons for many generations. Dragons are viewed by the Vikings of Burke not as creatures to understand but as monsters to be hunted, feared, and destroyed on sight. And the entire culture of the village has been built around combat training, defense drills, and raising the next generation of warriors who are expected to kill dragons without hesitation. At the center of this world is Hiccup Horrendous Haddock III, the teenage son of the village chief, Stoic the Vast. Unlike every other young Viking his age, Hiccup is not physically imposing, he is not naturally gifted with weapons, and he does not fit the mold of the fierce warrior his father hopes he will become. He is inventive, curious, and more interested in building machines and understanding the world around him than in charging into battle, which creates a quiet but persistent tension between him and his father, who worries that his son will never be able to protect the village or carry on his legacy as chief. Hiccup's turning point comes when he manages to shoot down a Night Fury, the rarest and most feared type of dragon in all of Burke, using an invention of his own design. Instead of killing the creature as tradition and his entire upbringing demand, Hiccup finds himself unable to go through with it when he sees the dragon lying helpless before him. This moment of hesitation changes the course of his life. He secretly returns to the dragon, discovers that it cannot fly properly because of an injury to its tail, and begins to form a bond with it that defies everything he has ever been taught. He names the dragon Toothless, and through patience, careful observation, and genuine curiosity rather than aggression, he begins to understand that dragons are not the mindless monsters his village has always believed them to be. As Hiccup's secret friendship with Toothless deepens, he begins applying what he learns from the dragon to his official dragon fighting training, which he is forced to attend alongside other Viking teens his age, including Astrid, a fiercely talented and disciplined young warrior who quickly becomes suspicious of how Hiccup is suddenly succeeding where he always used to fail. Hiccup's newfound understanding of dragon behavior, taken directly from his secret time with Toothless, allows him to calm and subdue dragons in training exercises without violence, and he unexpectedly becomes one of the most promising students in the class, much to the shock of his father, his peers, and the village's veteran dragon trainer. This success puts Hiccup in an impossible position, because his rising reputation as a dragon fighter is built entirely on knowledge gained from doing the exact opposite of what dragon fighting stands for. Eventually Astrid discovers Toothless and the truth about Hiccup's secret bond, and after an initial shock she is gradually won over by what she witnesses, coming to understand, as Hiccup did, that dragons are intelligent, emotional creatures capable of trust and companionship rather than senseless killers. As tensions rise within the village and the pressure builds for Hiccup to prove himself in a final dragon fighting trial in front of the whole community, the film builds toward a larger threat that goes beyond the conflict between Vikings and dragons alone. The dragons of the region, it turns out, have not been raiding Berk purely out of aggression but because they themselves are being controlled and terrorized by a far more massive and dangerous entity that dwells within a hidden nest, forcing them to steal food to survive. This revelation reframes the entire generation's long war between Vikings and dragons, showing that the true enemy was never the dragons at all, but a threat that both dragons and Vikings have unknowingly been suffering under. The story builds to a climactic confrontation in which Hiccup, Toothless, Astrid, and eventually the rest of Berk, including Stoik himself, must come together and unite in a way the village has never done before, fighting side by side with the dragons rather than against them in order to survive. The emotional core of the film remains the relationship between Hiccup and Toothless, a bond that begins in fear and mutual injury but grows into deep loyalty and trust, ultimately proving that connection and empathy can overcome generations of inherited hatred and fear. The cast of this live-action adaptation was carefully chosen to honor the spirit of the original characters while bringing new depth to them on screen. Mason Thames takes on the central role of Hiccup, delivering a performance that captures the character's awkwardness, wit, and quiet courage, and many who have seen the film have praised how naturally he embodies both the comedic and emotional sides of the character while still making the role distinctly his own. Nico Parker plays Astrid, bringing a grounded intensity to a character who has always represented discipline, skill, and eventual open-mindedness within the rigid Viking society of Berk. Gerard Butler returns to the franchise in the role of Stoik the Vast, and this casting choice carries particular weight because Butler is the only actor from the original animated trilogy to reprise his role in live-action form, having voiced Stoik across all three animated films. His return gives longtime fans of the franchise a direct thread of continuity between the animated era and this new live-action chapter, and his performance has been widely praised for capturing both the imposing physical presence and the underlying emotional vulnerability of a father struggling to understand his son. Nick Frost joins the cast as Gabba the Belch, the blacksmith and dragon training mentor of the village, bringing his familiar comedic timing to a character who has always served as both a source of humor and quiet wisdom in the story. Julian Dennison plays Fish Legs, one of Hiccup's fellow trainees, while Peter Serafinowicz, Gabriel Howell, Bronwyn James, and Harry Trevaldwyn round out the rest of the young Viking trainees and villagers who populate Berk. The film also features Ruth Codd and Naomi Werthner in supporting roles. Behind the camera, cinematographer Bill Pope, known for his work on visually distinct blockbusters, was brought on to shoot the film, giving Berk and its surrounding landscapes a rugged, weathered, cinematic quality, while editor Wyatt Smith worked to maintain the pacing and emotional rhythm that made the original animated films so effective. The production carried a budget of around $150 million, a reflection of the scale required to bring photorealistic dragons, sweeping fight sequences, and an entire Viking village to life through a combination of practical sets and advanced visual effects. In terms of release details, How to Train Your Dragon had a somewhat complicated road to theaters. It was originally scheduled to release on March 14, 2025, but the date was pushed back due to the writers' and actors' strikes that affected much of the film and television industry during that period, which also temporarily suspended production altogether in the summer of 2023. Once production resumed, Filming officially began in January 2024 in locations designed to recreate the harsh, dramatic look of the Isle of Burke, and principal photography wrapped in May of that same year. The film ultimately received a new release date of June 13, 2025, and it opened in theaters worldwide on that date under Universal Pictures. Prior to its wide release, the film had an early showing at CinemaCon in April 2025, where industry professionals and theater owners got their first extended look at the project ahead of the general public. Upon release, the film performed strongly at the global box office, and it received a warm reception from both audiences and critics, many of whom praised how faithfully it captured the emotional core and visual imagination of the original animated film while elevating the experience through the scale and realism that live action and modern visual effects can offer. The dragon designs in particular received significant praise, with many viewers noting that Toothless and the other dragons look remarkably lifelike while still retaining the expressive, emotive qualities that made them so beloved in animated form. Gerard Butler's performance as Stoic was frequently singled out as one of the emotional highlights of the film, alongside Mason Thames's portrayal of Hiccup, and many reviewers noted that the film managed to evoke genuine nostalgia while still standing on its own as a satisfying cinematic experience. This film represents a meaningful moment not just for DreamWorks Animation but for the broader trend of animated classics being reimagined for a new generation of moviegoers. It marks the 15th anniversary of the original 2010 film and the 11th anniversary of its first sequel, and it stands as proof that a beloved animated story can be translated into live action without losing the heart that made audiences fall in love with it in the first place. The decision to bring back the original director rather than starting from scratch with a new creative vision is part of what makes this adaptation feel less like a cash grab and more like a genuine continuation of a story that clearly still means a great deal to the people who created it. How to Train Your Dragon full story retelling. The story of How to Train Your Dragon begins on the island of Burke, a small and isolated Viking settlement perched on the edge of the known world, surrounded by icy seas, jagged cliffs, and a sky that is rarely calm for long. From the very first moments of the film, the tone of Burke is established through its constant state of alertness. This is not a peaceful farming village or a quiet fishing town. It is a community built entirely around survival, and that survival has depended for generations on the ability to fight off dragons. The film opens with the island under attack, dragons of every size and shape swooping down from the night sky, snatching sheep, setting thatched roofs ablaze, and sending Viking warriors scrambling out of their homes with weapons already drawn before they are even fully awake. The chaos of this opening raid is not simply spectacle. It is meant to immediately establish the rhythm of life on Burke, where dragon attacks are so frequent, and so expected that the villagers respond to them with practiced efficiency rather than panic. Buckets of water are passed hand to hand, catapults are wheeled into position, and even the youngest children know to run for shelter the moment the horns sound. At the center of this opening chaos is Hiccup, a lanky, scrawny teenage boy who narrates the sequence with a dry, self-aware sense of humor that immediately sets him apart from every other person on the island. He explains, almost apologetically, that everything about Burke is inconvenient. The weather is miserable, the location is remote, and the population spends the vast majority of its time either rebuilding what the dragons destroyed the night before or preparing to defend against the next attack. Hiccup is the son of Stoic the Vast, the enormous, thunderous, universally respected chief of the village, a man whose reputation as a dragon killer is so legendary that other Vikings speak his name with a mixture of awe and fear. Stoic is broad-shouldered, thick-bearded, and built like a man who has spent his entire life hurling himself directly into danger and walking away victorious. Hiccup, by contrast, is none of these things. He is thin, awkward, and far more interested in tinkering with mechanical inventions than in swinging an axe. This contrast between father and son is one of the emotional engines of the entire film, and it is established almost immediately, as Hiccup tries desperately to prove himself useful during the raid while simultaneously being ordered, again and again, to stay out of the fighting and go hide. During this opening battle, the village catches sight of something rare and feared, a dragon breed known as the Night Fury, a creature so fast and so elusive that most Vikings have never even seen one directly, only the aftermath of its attacks, which come without warning in the form of sudden explosive blasts that seem to strike out of nowhere. The Night Fury is spoken of almost like a ghost story among the villagers, a shadow that moves faster than the eye can follow and vanishes before anyone can react. While the rest of the village scrambles to fend off the more common dragon breeds, Hiccup sees an opportunity. He has built a mechanical contraption in secret, a bola launcher designed specifically with the hope of one day catching a dragon and proving to his father and the rest of Berk that he is not the burden everyone believes him to be. In a moment of reckless bravery that surprises even himself, Hiccup rushes out into the middle of the raid and fires his invention directly at the Night Fury as it streaks across the night sky. Against all odds, and against the disbelief of literally everyone who witnesses it, the shot connects, and the Night Fury spirals down out of the sky and disappears into the forest beyond the village. Nobody believes Hiccup when he tries to tell people what happened. In the pandemonium of the ongoing raid, his father, furious and exhausted, brushes off his son's claims entirely, more concerned with getting him to safety than entertaining a story about shooting down the most feared dragon in the world. This rejection stings deeply, though it is far from the first time Hiccup has felt dismissed by his father and by the village at large. As the raid winds down and the villagers begin the familiar process of assessing damage and repairing what has been destroyed, Stoic makes an announcement that will shape much of the story going forward. He declares that the time has come to find the dragon's nest once and for all, a place no Viking has ever successfully located despite generations of searching, and he intends to lead an expedition to hunt it down and end the war permanently. Before departing, he places Hiccup under the supervision of Gobber the Belch, the village blacksmith, a burly and endlessly practical man missing a hand and a leg, both lost to dragon encounters over the years, who now spends his days forging weapons and running the training program for the village's next generation of dragon fighters. Hiccup, desperate to prove that he did in fact shoot down a Night Fury, sneaks away from his chores at the blacksmith's shop and heads into the forest to search for evidence of what he witnessed. What he finds is not a corpse or a trophy, but the dragon itself, alive, tangled in the ropes of Hiccup's own bola contraption, unable to fly because of an injury sustained in the crash. This is the moment the entire story pivots around. Hiccup approaches the fallen Night Fury with his knife raised, fully intending to kill it, and finally claim the recognition he has always wanted, the recognition that would prove to his father, and to every Viking on Berk that he belongs among them. But as he stands over the creature, staring into its wide, expressive, strikingly intelligent eyes, something in him falters. The dragon, despite being completely at his mercy, looks back at him not with mindless rage but with something that looks unmistakably like fear. Hiccup cannot bring himself to finish the act. He lowers his knife, turns, and walks away, unable to explain even to himself why he could not do the one thing his entire upbringing had prepared him to do. This hesitation haunts Hiccup, and rather than letting the moment go, he finds himself drawn back to the same spot in the forest days later, driven by a mixture of guilt, curiosity, and something he cannot quite name. He discovers that the dragon is still there, still tangled in the ropes, unable to free itself and unable to fly away. Rather than killing it or reporting its location to the village, Hiccup makes the quiet, dangerous decision to cut it loose. The dragon, freed from its restraints, immediately turns on him, pinning him to the ground with startling speed and baring rows of terrifying teeth. For a moment it seems as though Hiccup's mercy will cost him his life. But instead of attacking, the dragon simply stares at him, seemingly as confused by the situation as Hiccup is, before releasing him and attempting to fly away. It cannot get more than a short distance off the ground before crashing back down, and it is in this moment that Hiccup realizes the dragon's tail was damaged in the fall, one half of it torn away entirely, leaving the creature grounded and unable to escape the island on its own. Rather than reporting this discovery or seeking help, Hiccup begins secretly returning to the cove where the dragon is trapped, driven by a growing fascination with the creature that defies everything he has been taught about dragons being mindless, soulless monsters. He begins sketching the dragon's tail in his notebook, studying its structure, and slowly, cautiously, attempting to build trust with the animal through small offerings of fish and quiet, non-threatening behavior. He names the dragon Toothless, an ironic nickname born from the fact that the creature's teeth, which had seemed so terrifying at first, are actually retractable, sliding in and out of its gums depending on its mood, giving it an almost comically gummy appearance when it is calm. These early scenes between Hiccup and Toothless form the emotional heart of the film, built not around grand action but around small, patient moments of connection. Hiccup learns to read the dragon's body language, to understand the subtle differences between aggression and curiosity, and slowly the two begin to form a bond built on mutual trust rather than fear. While all of this is happening in secret, Hiccup's life above ground continues to unravel in a different direction. Stoic returns from his failed expedition to find the dragon's nest, having found nothing and lost time he did not have, and he decides that Hiccup, now old enough, must join the village's dragon training program alongside the other teenagers his age. This program, run by Galber, is designed to prepare young Vikings for a lifetime of combat against dragons, culminating in a final trial where the top student earns the honor of killing a dragon in front of the entire village. Hiccup is horrified by this development, terrified both of being forced to fight actual dragons in front of his peers and of the possibility that his secret friendship with Toothless might somehow be discovered or jeopardized. He is thrown into training alongside a group of other teenagers, each with their own distinct personality. There is Astrid, disciplined, fiercely competitive, and by far the most naturally talented fighter among the group, who has spent her entire life preparing for this exact opportunity, and has no patience for anyone who might slow her down. There is Fish Legs, nervous, encyclopedic in his knowledge of dragon species and their weaknesses, more comfortable reciting facts from a book than actually facing a dragon in combat. There are also the twins, chaotic and competitive with each other in equal measure, along with Snotlout, brash, overconfident, and constantly trying to one-up everyone around him, particularly Hiccup, who he has always viewed as an easy target. Hiccup enters training expecting to fail spectacularly, and for the first session, he does. But something changes almost immediately, because everything Hiccup is secretly learning from his time with Toothless begins to translate directly into his ability to handle dragons in the training ring. He begins to understand instinctively what a dragon is thinking based on subtle cues in its posture and behavior, knowledge that no other Viking possesses because no other Viking has ever spent quiet, patient hours building trust with a living dragon rather than simply trying to kill it. In one training session after another, Hiccup finds himself succeeding not through brute strength or aggression, which he has never possessed, but through calm, careful observation and a willingness to approach dragons with curiosity rather than violence. He begins calming dragons that the other trainees cannot get anywhere near, using techniques and instincts drawn directly from his growing bond with Toothless. His transformation from the clumsiest, most overlooked member of the village into one of the most promising students in dragon training sends shockwaves through Burke. Stoic, who is preparing to leave once again to continue searching for the dragon's nest, is stunned and quietly proud, unable to fully understand what has changed in his son but grateful, for the first time in years, that Hiccup finally seems to be finding his place. This sudden success does not go unnoticed by Astrid, who has spent her entire life working relentlessly to become the best in her class, only to watch Hiccup, previously the clear weakest link in the group, begin outperforming her seemingly overnight. Her suspicion of Hiccup grows steadily throughout this stretch of the story, and she becomes increasingly determined to figure out what exactly has changed about him. Meanwhile, Hiccup's double life becomes more and more difficult to manage. By day he is being praised and celebrated in the training ring for skills he does not fully understand himself, and by night he continues sneaking away to the cove to spend time with Toothless, who by this point has become the closest and most important relationship in his life, closer even than his relationship with his own father. During these secret visits, Hiccup begins working on a prosthetic tail fin for Toothless, applying his natural gift for invention and mechanics to design a replacement for the half of the tail that was lost. Through trial and error, and through countless failed attempts, the two of them slowly develop a system in which Hiccup, riding on Toothless' back, manually controls the mechanical tail fin using foot pedals, allowing the dragon to fly again for the first time since the crash, but only with Hiccup's direct assistance. The sequences depicting Hiccup and Toothless' first successful flights together represent some of the most significant emotional turning points in the film. What begins as clumsy, uncertain, and frequently disastrous attempts to get airborne slowly transforms into something exhilarating and joyful, as the two of them learn to move together as a single unit, trusting each other completely in ways that neither of them trusts anyone else on the island. These flights take Hiccup far beyond anything he has ever experienced in his life on Berk, soaring above the clouds, gliding between towering sea stacks, and diving toward the ocean's surface at speeds that no Viking vessel could ever match. For the first time in his life, Hiccup feels a sense of freedom and belonging that has always eluded him within the rigid, combat-focused culture of his village. This bond between rider and dragon becomes the emotional core that the rest of the story is built around, and it stands in direct contrast to the escalating pressure Hiccup faces within the dragon training program, where his growing skill is pushing him closer and closer to the very trial he has been dreading. The moment when he will be expected to kill a dragon in front of the entire village to prove himself as a true Viking warrior. Eventually, Astrid's suspicions lead her to follow Hiccup on one of his secret trips to the cove, and she discovers the truth that he has been hiding from everyone, including a living, breathing night fury and a friendship between the two of them that defies everything she has ever been taught about dragons. Her initial reaction is one of shock and fear, and she nearly gives away Hiccup's secret before he manages to convince her to give him a chance to explain. In a pivotal sequence, Hiccup takes Astrid on a flight aboard Toothless, and much as it did for Hiccup himself, the experience of soaring above the world alongside a dragon rather than fighting against one begins to change her perspective. She witnesses firsthand the intelligence, the personality, and the emotional depth of the creature she has spent her entire life being trained to kill, and slowly, cautiously, she begins to understand what Hiccup has been trying to tell her. This shift in Astrid's understanding becomes crucial to the story going forward, as she transitions from being Hiccup's primary threat of exposure into one of his few real allies, someone who now shares the burden of his secret, and increasingly believes that everything the village has been taught about dragons might be fundamentally wrong. As Hiccup's dragon training success continues to escalate, he eventually finds himself named the top student in his class, earning him the honor and the terrifying obligation of facing a dragon directly in the final trial in front of the entire village, a tradition meant to formally mark his transition into adulthood as a warrior of Berk. This puts Hiccup in an impossible position. He has spent weeks building a life-changing friendship with the dragon, learning firsthand that everything his village believes about these creatures is wrong, and yet he is now expected to publicly kill one in order to be accepted by the very community he has always longed to belong to. The dragon selected for his trial is a monstrous nightmare, one of the most aggressive and dangerous breeds on the island, kept in a locked pit specifically for this purpose. As the day of the trial approaches, Hiccup grows increasingly desperate, torn between his loyalty to Toothless and everything he has learned from their friendship, and his lifelong desire to finally earn his father's approval and prove himself worthy of the Haddock name. Before the trial can take place, the story is disrupted by a dramatic complication. Stoic returns from another failed expedition searching for the dragon's nest, and in a moment of pride and celebration over his son's transformation, he decides to give Hiccup a gift, a Viking helmet forged from metal that once belonged to Hiccup's mother, a woman who died when Hiccup was very young. This gesture represents one of the most emotionally significant moments between father and son in the entire film, as Stoic, a man who has always struggled to connect with his son, finally expresses genuine pride and affection, believing that Hiccup has finally become the Viking he always hoped he would be. This moment is devastating precisely because of the dramatic irony underlying it, since the audience knows, and Hiccup increasingly feels, that his father's pride is built on a fundamental misunderstanding of who Hiccup has actually become, and what he actually believes. The tension comes to a head when Hiccup, unable to reconcile the person his father believes him to be with the truth of his friendship with Toothless, decides he can no longer keep his secret hidden, particularly as the trial draws near and he faces the prospect of being forced to kill a dragon in front of everyone he knows. Before he can find the right moment to reveal the truth, however, events spiral out of his control. Astrid, now aware of the full truth and believing that Hiccup deserves the chance to explain himself before the situation grows any more complicated, urges him to come clean, but circumstances intervene before he is able to do so on his own terms. Meanwhile, Toothless, sensing danger or perhaps reacting instinctively after being cooped up and hidden away for so long, becomes agitated, and in a moment of chaos, he is discovered by other members of the village, setting off a chain of events that Hiccup can no longer control. During the climactic trial itself, held in the village arena in front of the entire population of Berk, Hiccup is finally forced to confront the impossible position he has been trying to avoid. Rather than fighting the monstrous nightmare as expected, he attempts to use the same techniques he learned from Toothless, approaching the dragon with calm, non-threatening body language instead of aggression. For a brief, stunned moment, it actually seems to work, and the crowd watches in disbelief as Hiccup manages to calm the supposedly uncontrollable dragon without violence. But this fragile peace is shattered when Toothless, who has broken free from where he was being held, arrives in the arena, and in the ensuing panic and confusion, the truth that Hiccup has been hiding is finally exposed to the entire village. Stoic, watching his son interact peacefully with dragons rather than fighting them, is overcome with a mixture of horror, betrayal, and disbelief. In the chaos that follows, Toothless, reacting protectively and instinctively to the threat surrounding Hiccup, inadvertently causes Stoic to be knocked down, an act that is misread by the horrified crowd as a deliberate attack. Rather than allowing the situation to escalate further, Hiccup makes the desperate decision to have Toothless fly them both away from the arena entirely, hoping to protect the dragon from the village's inevitable fury. This moment marks the emotional low point of the film, as everything Hiccup has worked so hard to build, both his relationship with his father and his standing within the village, seems to collapse in an instant. Stoic, devastated and enraged by what he perceives as his son's betrayal, orders Toothless captured and imprisoned, believing the dragon to be responsible for turning his son against his own people. It is during this period of captivity that Stoic, desperate for information that might help him finally locate and destroy the dragon's nest once and for all, forces information out of the captured Toothless by threatening him, using the dragon's clear affection for Hiccup as leverage. Reluctantly, and only after realizing the alternative might be worse, Toothless reveals the location of the nest, setting the stage for the film's climactic confrontation. Stoic, along with the rest of Berk's warriors, immediately sets out with Toothless in tow, intending to use the captured dragon to help them finally locate and destroy the nest that has evaded Vikings for generations. Left behind on Berk, Hiccup is devastated, having lost both his father's trust and his closest friend in the same catastrophic sequence of events. It is during this low point that Astrid, along with the rest of Hiccup's fellow trainees, who by this point have also begun to reconsider everything they thought they knew about dragons after witnessing what happened in the arena, come together to support him. Hiccup, driven by guilt over what has happened to Toothless and a growing understanding that there is far more at stake than he initially realized, reveals to the group the true scale of the threat waiting at the dragon's nest, a threat he learned about gradually through his time with Toothless and the deeper mythology surrounding why dragons behave the way they do. Rather than being simple, mindless raiders, the dragons of the region, Hiccup explains, are not attacking Burke purely out of hostility. They are being controlled, forced by fear into raiding the village to gather food, all because of a far more massive and terrifying creature that lives deep within the hidden nest, a creature so enormous and dangerous that even the dragons themselves are utterly subservient to it, driven by instinctive terror into serving its endless hunger. This revelation reframes the entire generations-long conflict between Vikings and dragons in a completely new light. The dragons raiding Burke are not the true enemy at all, but rather victims of the same threat that has been devastating the village for years, trapped in a cycle of fear and forced servitude every bit as brutal as anything the Vikings have endured. Realizing that his father and the rest of Burke's warriors are walking directly into a confrontation with this massive, unknown threat completely unprepared, Hiccup and his fellow trainees make the decision to follow them, riding on the backs of the very dragons that Burke has spent years training its children to fight and kill. In one of the film's most visually striking and thematically resonant sequences, each of the young Vikings mounts a different dragon breed that they have grown close to during their training, flying together toward the nest not as hunters seeking to destroy dragons, but as allies seeking to save both dragons and Vikings alike from a shared enemy. When they arrive at the nest, they find Stoic and the Viking fleet already engaged in a desperate and losing battle against the creature within, an enormous, monstrous dragon of almost unimaginable size, one that dwarfs every other dragon in the film and commands the loyalty and terror of every smaller dragon in the region. This creature, often referred to among fans of the franchise as the Red Death, represents the true source of the conflict that has plagued Burke for generations, a threat far beyond anything the villagers had ever imagined when they believed themselves to simply be at war with ordinary dragons. As the battle rages and Stoic's forces struggle against the sheer overwhelming size and power of the creature, Hiccup and his fellow trainees arrive, and in a moment that finally begins to heal the fractured relationship between father and son, Stoic sees his son not as a traitor but as someone fighting bravely alongside him against a threat that neither of them could have defeated alone. Toothless, reunited with Hiccup after being forced by Stoic to lead the fleet to the nest, becomes central to the battle that follows, as his speed, agility, and unique abilities as a Night Fury make him one of the only creatures capable of standing any real chance against the massive threat they now face. The climactic battle against the enormous dragon at the heart of the nest is chaotic, dangerous, and filled with near-catastrophic moments for both the Viking fighters and the dragons now fighting alongside them. Hiccup, riding Toothless, becomes instrumental in the fight, using the same combination of trust, skill, and quick thinking that defined his earlier training to guide Toothless through the aerial battle even as the massive creature proves far more dangerous and destructive than anything either of them has faced before. In the film's most intense sequence, Hiccup and Toothless work together in a desperate, high-stakes aerial maneuver, drawing the enormous creature into a chase through the clouds before ultimately using Toothless' signature plasma blast ability to strike a decisive blow. The confrontation reaches its peak as the massive dragon, wounded and enraged, crashes down in a final, catastrophic collapse, bringing the battle to its climax. In the chaos of the fight's conclusion, disaster strikes. As Toothless and Hiccup attempt to escape the destruction unfolding around them, Hiccup's prosthetic tail fin, the very mechanism that has allowed Toothless to fly since the beginning of their friendship, is damaged in the crash, sending both of them plummeting toward the ground. In the film's most gut-wrenching moment, Toothless, in a desperate act of protection, wraps his wings around Hiccup as they fall, shielding him from the worst of the impact at what appears to be a devastating cost to himself. When Hiccup regains consciousness in the aftermath of the crash, he finds Stoic nearby, and in a moment charged with both relief and grief, the two share a reconciliation that has been building throughout the entire film, with Stoic finally expressing genuine understanding and acceptance of who his son has truly become, someone who found a way to end a generations-long war not through brute strength but through empathy, patience, and connection. The story concludes with the emotional aftermath of the battle, as the village of Burke begins to rebuild not just its physical structures but its entire way of life. With the true source of the conflict finally destroyed and dragons freed from the fear and forced servitude that had driven their raids for generations, the relationship between Vikings and dragons undergoes a complete transformation. Dragons that were once seen only as enemies to be hunted are gradually welcomed into the village, and the culture of Burke begins shifting from one built around combat and survival into something entirely new, a community where humans and dragons live side by side. Hiccup, once the most overlooked and dismissed member of his village, emerges from the story as someone who fundamentally changed the course of his people's history, not through strength or aggression but through curiosity, empathy, and his willingness to see value in something everyone else had been taught to fear and destroy. His relationship with Toothless, which began with a moment of mercy in a quiet forest clearing, ultimately becomes the foundation upon which an entirely new future for both Vikings and dragons is built. The film closes on an image of Hiccup and Toothless soaring above the newly transformed island of Burke, no longer defined by war and fear but by the possibility of coexistence and friendship, a fitting conclusion to a story that has always, at its heart, been about the power of understanding and connection to overcome even the deepest, most deeply ingrained hostility. What began as a simple tale of a boy who could not bring himself to kill a dragon ultimately becomes a much larger story about breaking cycles of fear and violence that have persisted for generations, a message that resonates just as powerfully in this live-action adaptation as it did in the original animated film that inspired it 15 years earlier. If you enjoyed this complete story breakdown of How to Train Your Dragon and want to relive every twist, every emotional turn, and every moment of the bond between Hiccup and Toothless, do not forget to like this video, share it with fellow fans of the franchise, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next deep dive into your favorite films. How to Train Your Dragon cast biographies. The live-action How to Train Your Dragon brought together a cast spanning generations of film and television, mixing rising young talent with seasoned performers who each carried years of experience into the world of Burke. Understanding who these actors are, where they came from, and how they built their careers gives an even deeper appreciation for the film they eventually created together, and this breakdown takes a detailed look at the life and career of every major member of the cast. At the very center of the film is Mason Thames, the young American actor who plays Hiccup Horrendous Haddock III. Thames was born on July 10, 2007, in Dallas, Texas, and grew up in the McKinney and Prosper area of the Dallas metropolitan region in a supportive family that encouraged his creative interests from a young age. Long before he ever appeared in front of a camera, Thames spent his childhood immersed in movement and performance, following in the footsteps of his older sister, Brooke Madison Thames, who is a professional ballet dancer. Inspired by her, Mason began training in ballet himself and continued for roughly 4 years, eventually being selected to perform with a professional international ballet company, touring with them as the youngest member of the cast. He performed in productions of The Nutcracker during this period, developing a level of physical discipline, control, and stage presence that would later prove invaluable once he transitioned into acting. Alongside his dance training, Thames grew up with a deep love of cinema, spending countless hours watching action and science fiction films with his father, experiences that helped shape his early fascination with storytelling and performance. He began pursuing acting seriously around the age of 11, making his first appearances in short films before landing a recurring role on the Apple TV Plus series For All Mankind, which gave him his earliest sustained experience working in a professional television production. His breakthrough into wider public recognition came in 2021 with The Black Phone, a psychological horror film directed by Scott Derrickson, in which Thames played the lead role of Finney Blake, a terrified teenager attempting to escape a masked kidnapper. The film became a significant commercial success, grossing well over its production budget worldwide, and critics praised Thames specifically for the emotional depth and intensity he brought to a role that demanded far more range than most actors his age are ever asked to deliver. Following that breakout performance, Thames continued building his filmography with additional projects, including further collaborations that expanded his range beyond horror, before eventually being cast as Hiccup in How to Train Your Dragon, a role that required him to balance physical comedy, emotional vulnerability, and the kind of quiet, introspective characterization that defined the character in the original animated films. To prepare for the physically demanding aspects of the role, including harness work for the flying sequences, Thames drew directly on the discipline and body control instilled in him through years of ballet training. Outside of his acting career, Thames has largely kept his personal life private, focusing on his family and close friendships rather than public visibility, and he has continued his education through online schooling in order to accommodate the demands of a rapidly growing film career. As of the release of How to Train Your Dragon, he had already established himself as one of the most promising young leading actors of his generation, with industry observers noting his ability to select roles that challenge him creatively while steadily building a devoted global fan base. Playing opposite Thames in the role of Astrid Hofferson is Nico Parker, an English actress born on December 9, 2004, in Kensal Rise, a neighborhood in northwest London. Nico comes from a family deeply embedded in the entertainment industry, as the daughter of Thandai Newton, the acclaimed British actress known for her work in Westworld and Crash, and O.L. Parker, an English screenwriter and director known for films including The Best Exotic Marigold Hotel and Mamma Mia Here We Go Again. Her parents met in the mid-1990s while working together on a television film that O.L. Parker had written and Thandai Newton starred in, and the two were married in 1998, remaining together for over 2 decades before separating in 2022. Nico grew up alongside 2 siblings, and despite being surrounded by the film industry from a very early age, she has said in interviews that acting did not initially interest her, recalling that as a child she found the process of watching her parents work rather boring, since so much of their time on set seemed to involve waiting around rather than actual performing. Her perspective shifted dramatically once she was cast in her first film role, in the 2019 live-action adaptation of Dumbo, playing Millie Ferrier. She has described the experience of making that film as transformative, saying that she became completely absorbed in the process and realized almost immediately that acting was exactly what she wanted to pursue as a career. Following her debut, Parker continued building a distinctive filmography built around dramatic and often emotionally demanding roles rather than simply trading on her family name. In 2023, she gained significant critical attention for her performance as Sarah Miller in the first season of the HBO series The Last of Us, a role that required her to portray a teenager navigating a father-daughter relationship in the earliest hours of a pandemic outbreak, and her performance in that limited but pivotal role was widely praised by critics and audiences alike. She went on to appear in additional film projects, including the drama Suncoast and the science fiction film Reminiscence, before being cast as Astrid in How to Train Your Dragon, a role that called for a very different kind of physicality and toughness than her earlier dramatic work. Despite her famous parents, Nico has spoken about their approach to her career as intentionally hands-off, explaining that while they are always willing to offer advice when asked, they have made a point of allowing her to build her own path and have her own experiences within the industry rather than shaping her career directly. Her chosen professional name itself carries a small piece of family history, inspired by the German singer Nico, known for her work with the Velvet Underground, a name her parents selected because they felt it demanded that she grow into someone equally distinctive. The role of Stoic the Vast is played by Gerard Butler, the Scottish actor whose casting carries particular significance within the franchise, since he is the only performer from the original animated trilogy to return and reprise his role in this live-action adaptation. Butler was born on November 13, 1969, in Paisley, Scotland, the youngest of 3 children in a family of Irish Catholic descent. His early childhood included a brief period living in Montreal, Canada, after his family relocated there when he was only a few months old, though the family returned to Scotland following his parents' divorce, and Butler was subsequently raised primarily by his mother in Paisley. He had little to no contact with his father during much of his childhood, a relationship that only began to repair itself once Butler reached his mid-teens, and his father passed away while Butler was still in his early 20s. As a young man, Butler pursued an entirely different path from the one that would eventually make him famous, enrolling at the University of Glasgow to study law and eventually graduating with honors, going so far as to serve as president of the university's Law Society thanks to his naturally outgoing personality. After completing his studies, he began a legal traineeship at a firm in Edinburgh, fully intending to become a practicing solicitor, but he found the work unfulfilling and increasingly difficult to reconcile with the direction he felt his life pulling toward. Just before completing his traineeship, and after being inspired by a stage production, Butler made the decision to abandon law entirely in favor of acting, a choice that ultimately led to him being let go from the law firm. He moved to London, taking on a series of odd jobs while pursuing stage work, and his first significant break came when he was cast in a production of Shakespeare's Coriolanus in his late 20s, a role that helped establish him within British theatre circles. He transitioned into film work through supporting roles in productions such as Mrs. Brown and the James Bond film Tomorrow Never Dies, before landing his first major leading role as the title character in Dracula 2000. Continued momentum carried him through further leading roles in the early 2000s, including Timeline and a widely acclaimed turn as the title character in the film adaptation of The Phantom of the Opera. Butler's career reached a new level of global recognition in 2006 with his performance as King Leonidas in 300, a role that turned him into one of the most recognizable action stars of his generation and led to a long run of leading roles across romantic comedies, war epics, and large-scale action franchises, including the Has Fallen series. His involvement with the How to Train Your Dragon franchise began with the original 2010 animated film, in which he voiced Stoic, and he continued in that role across the animated sequels, making his casting in the live-action version feel less like new casting and more like a continuation of a character he had already spent over a decade inhabiting. Butler has also been open in interviews about past struggles with alcohol earlier in his adult life, stating that he has remained sober since 2011 following a period of treatment, and he currently divides much of his time between Los Angeles and his native Glasgow. Nick Frost takes on the role of Gauba the Belch, the village blacksmith and dragon training instructor, bringing decades of comedic experience to a character who blends humor with quiet mentorship. Frost was born on March 28, 1972, in the Essex area of Greater London, and unlike many of his castmates, he did not originally set out to become an actor at all. Before entering the entertainment industry, Frost spent years working service industry jobs, including a lengthy stretch working in a Mexican restaurant as a waiter, bartender, and cook. His path into acting came largely through his close friendship with fellow actor and writer Simon Pegg, whom he met while the two were working together and later lived with as flatmates. Pegg has often credited Frost with broadening his own cultural interests during this period, while Frost's introduction to acting came almost by accident when Pegg encouraged him to audition for a role in the television series Spaced, a sitcom co-created by Pegg, Jessica Hines, and director Edgar Wright that first aired in 1999. Frost's performance as Mike Wood in that series marked the beginning of what would become one of the most enduring creative partnerships in modern British comedy. He and Pegg went on to collaborate on the Three Flavors Cornetto trilogy, a series of genre-blending comedic films directed by Edgar Wright, beginning with the 2004 zombie comedy Shaun of the Dead, in which Frost played Ed, the loyal but chronically unmotivated best friend of Pegg's character. The film became a cult classic and established the Pegg-Frost partnership as a defining creative force in British comedy. They followed this with Hot Fuzz in 2007, in which Frost played an enthusiastic and somewhat clumsy police officer, and later concluded the trilogy with The World's End in 2013, for which Frost received award nominations recognizing his comedic performance. Beyond his work with Peg, Frost expanded his career considerably over the following years, co-writing and starring in the science fiction comedy Paul alongside Peg, appearing in Joe Cornish's acclaimed film Attack the Block, and continuing to build a reputation as one of British comedy's most reliable and versatile performers. He has also worked as a writer and producer on multiple television projects, including the horror comedy series Truth Seekers, which he both starred in and helped develop. Frost's casting as Galber in How to Train Your Dragon connected him to a franchise with which he had prior familiarity, as he had voiced the same character in earlier animated Dragons media, allowing him to bring an established sense of the character's warmth and gruff humor directly into the live-action version. Julian Dennison, who plays Fish Legs, one of Hiccup's fellow dragon training recruits, brings his own distinctive journey from New Zealand to the film. Dennison was born on October 26, 2002, in Lower Hutt, a city near Wellington, New Zealand, the third of 4 children in his family and a twin brother to his sibling Christian. He is of Maori descent, belonging to the Ngati Hawa Iwi and connected to the Tainui Tribal Confederation, a heritage that has remained an important part of his identity throughout his career. Dennison's earliest exposure to performing came through a New Zealand Transport Agency public service announcement about drunk driving, which unexpectedly became something of an internet sensation across New Zealand and Australia. The commercial was directed by filmmaker Taika Waititi, who was so impressed by the young Dennison's natural screen presence that he offered him the lead role in his upcoming film without requiring an audition. That film, Hunt for the Wilderpeople, released in 2016, saw Dennison play Ricky Baker, a rebellious foster child who goes on the run through the New Zealand wilderness with his reluctant foster uncle. The film became the highest-grossing New Zealand film in history and earned widespread critical acclaim, with Dennison's performance singled out as a major reason for its success, praised for combining humor, vulnerability, and authenticity in a way that resonated far beyond New Zealand's borders. The visibility from that role opened doors internationally, and in 2018 Dennison was cast in the Marvel film Deadpool 2, playing Russell Collins, a young mutant known as Fire Fist, a role he earned largely on the strength of his Wilderpeople performance combined with director connections between Waititi and the Deadpool filmmaking team. He continued building his blockbuster resume with a role in Godzilla vs. Kong in 2021. And he took on a leading role in the New Zealand drama Uproar in 2023, a film that allowed him to explore more serious dramatic material tied closely to his own cultural background. Before any of these larger roles, Dennison had already begun acting professionally at the age of 11, appearing in the 2013 film Shopping, a performance that earned him an award for Best Supporting Actor and served as his earliest professional credit. His casting in How to Train Your Dragon added another major studio franchise to a filmography that already spanned comedy, blockbuster action, and homegrown New Zealand cinema, further establishing him as one of his country's most successful young exports to international film. Peter Serafinowicz, who portrays a supporting role within the world of Burke, brings one of the most eclectic careers among the film's cast. Born on July 10, 1972, in Liverpool, England, Serafinowicz grew up in the Belle Vale area of the city as the eldest of 3 children, in a working-class Catholic household with deep Belarusian and Polish roots on his father's side. His mother worked as a postal clerk while his father worked in construction, and Serafinowicz has spoken openly in interviews about his childhood neighborhood being a rough and often difficult place to grow up. As a teenager, he developed twin passions that would come to define much of his creative life: indie music and television comedy, having been particularly struck by watching an early television performance by the band The Smiths. He briefly attempted a music career himself, fronting a short-lived teenage band, before shifting his focus toward comedy, drawing inspiration from British television impressionists. After completing his education, Serafinowicz began his professional career in radio, making his broadcasting debut in 1993 on a BBC Radio 1 spoof program before moving through a series of other radio comedy programs on BBC Radio 4. His transition into television and film accelerated through the late 1990s, and he became closely associated with the same circle of British comedic talent that included Simon Pegg and Edgar Wright, appearing in the original run of Spaced as a recurring antagonist character. His film career gained wider visibility through a supporting role in Shaun of the Dead in 2004, and he became particularly well known to global audiences for his voice work, most notably providing the voice of Darth Maul in Star Wars Episode I, The Phantom Menace. He went on to create and star in his own sketch comedy program, The Peter Serafinowicz Show, which aired on BBC Two and earned him both a major British Comedy Award and a BAFTA nomination. Over the following years he continued building an unusually broad career spanning voice acting in major franchises including Guardians of the Galaxy, live-action supporting roles in productions such as John Wick Chapter 2, and a starring role in the television adaptation of The Tick. His casting in How to Train Your Dragon added a Viking village elder to an already remarkably diverse body of work spanning radio, sketch comedy, blockbuster voice acting, and dramatic television. Beyond these central performers, the film's cast includes a group of additional young actors who round out the roster of Hiccup's fellow Viking trainees and the wider population of Burke, including Gabriel Howell, Bronwyn James, and Harry Trevaldwyn, each of whom brought prior experience in British film and television into their roles as members of the Dragon training class. Alongside supporting performers Ruth Codd and Naomi Worthner, who contributed to the film's wider ensemble of Viking villagers. Together, this cast, spanning Texas Ballet Studios, London Film Dynasties, Scottish law schools, Essex restaurant kitchens, New Zealand public service commercials, and Liverpool council estates, reflects just how varied and unexpected the road to Burke truly was for each performer, each of them bringing a completely different life story to the same windswept island of Vikings and dragons. If you enjoyed getting to know the real people behind the characters of How to Train Your Dragon, do not forget to like this video, share it with fellow fans of the cast and the franchise, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next deep dive into the actors who bring your favorite films to life. How to Train Your Dragon budget, production, and funny moments on set. Bringing How to Train Your Dragon into live action was never going to be a small undertaking, and the numbers behind the production tell a story of just how ambitious Universal Pictures and DreamWorks Animation were willing to be with a beloved piece of animated history. The film carried a production budget of approximately $150 million, a figure that placed it firmly among the biggest blockbuster investments of that release year and reflected the sheer scale required to recreate an entire Viking world populated with photorealistic dragons, sprawling coastal villages, and elaborate practical sets built to survive brutal outdoor shooting conditions. That budget had to stretch across multiple demanding categories at once, covering everything from the construction of full-scale physical sets representing the village of Burke, to the costume department's recreation of authentic-looking Viking armor and clothing, to the visual effects teams responsible for bringing dragons like Toothless to life in a way that felt tactile and believable rather than obviously computer-generated. Composer John Powell, who had already spent years shaping the musical identity of the franchise through the animated trilogy, returned to score the live-action film as well, and his continued involvement meant that a portion of the budget went toward recording an entirely new orchestral score designed to feel both familiar to longtime fans and grander in scale to match the increased visual scope of live action. A significant portion of the budget went directly into physical production rather than digital effects alone, since director Dean DeBois made the deliberate choice to build as much of Burke as possible using real sets and real locations rather than relying entirely on green screen environments. Production designers worked to construct an enormous, functional Viking village at Belfast Harbour Studios and Titanic Studios in Northern Ireland, two of the largest film production facilities in Europe, with sets so massive and so structurally sound that Gerard Butler himself commented that watching them assembled, he found himself wondering how the production team had even managed to pull it off, given how faithfully they mirrored the details fans already knew from the animated film. Filming officially began in January 2024 following a brief delay caused by the writers' and actors' strikes that affected the broader film industry throughout 2023, and production continued for several months before wrapping in May of that year. Of that shooting schedule, the production spent a large stretch, roughly 38 days, filming inside the controlled environment of the Belfast studios, while approximately 12 additional days were spent on location at various outdoor sites scattered across Northern Ireland, along with additional shooting in the Faroe Islands and Iceland, locations chosen specifically because their raw, windswept, dramatic coastlines matched the tone of Berk far more convincingly than anything that could be built entirely on a soundstage. Among the real-world locations used to bring Berk to life, Tullamore Forest Park in County Down became one of the most significant, serving as the backdrop for several pivotal moments, including sequences where Hiccup trains with Toothless in the secluded cove. The park, which had previously been used as a filming location for other major fantasy productions, offered the kind of dense, moody woodland atmosphere that suited the secretive, intimate nature of Hiccup and Toothless' early scenes together. Dunseverick Castle, a ruined tower perched dramatically along the cliffs of the North Antrim coast, and the nearby Giant's Causeway, provided the rugged coastal backdrops used for several key emotional conversations between Hiccup and Astrid, their jagged rock formations and crashing waves lending the scenes a sense of danger and isolation that matched the tone of the story. Merlo Bay added yet another dramatic coastal setting to the mix, further expanding the sense that Berk was not confined to a single studio backlit but genuinely existed across a rugged and varied landscape. Additional visual effects work and select pickup shots were completed afterward in Los Angeles, allowing the production to finish certain sequences that required more controlled environments or additional technical work once principal photography in the United Kingdom had concluded. The decision to film so extensively in Northern Ireland had ripple effects well beyond the production itself. According to Northern Ireland Screen, the organization responsible for supporting film production in the region, How to Train Your Dragon returned more than £59 million to the local economy, a substantial figure driven by the production's employment of a workforce of more than 900 local crew members, cast, and background performers. Northern Ireland Screen also contributed just over £2 million directly to the production as part of its efforts to attract large-scale international filmmaking to the region, an investment that ultimately paid off many times over given the size of the economic activity the production generated. Beyond the financial impact, the production also made efforts to operate sustainably, reusing set materials creatively wherever possible, shifting away from diesel generators toward local power sources when the option was available, and donating leftover catering food to communities near the various filming locations rather than allowing it to go to waste. An approach that felt fitting for a story fundamentally about learning to live in harmony with the natural world rather than working against it. Gerard Butler's transformation into Stoic the Vast stands as one of the most physically demanding aspects of the entire production, and the actor has spoken candidly about just how intense the process of embodying the character truly was. His full costume, once every layer, piece of armor, and prop had been added, weighed an astonishing 90 pounds, and Butler wore that costume for a stretch of roughly 9 weeks throughout filming. He has described the experience with a mixture of exhaustion and genuine enthusiasm, explaining that despite the cold, wet conditions of the Northern Irish winter, he found himself sweating heavily underneath the costume any time he was actively working, even as the rest of the cast and crew shivered around him in far lighter clothing. Butler has said that stepping onto set fully dressed as Stoic, wearing the enormous helmet and layered armor, gave him an almost physical sense of transformation, joking that the costume made him feel roughly 8 feet tall and impossible to ignore the moment he walked into a scene. Far from resenting the discomfort, Butler has described the weight and bulk of the costume as something that actually helped him access the character more fully, allowing him to carry himself with the same commanding, immovable presence that defines Stoic within the story. Beyond the demands of the costume itself, Butler's time in Belfast produced its own share of memorable, light-hearted moments once the cameras stopped rolling. Butler has spoken warmly about how quickly the city and its people embraced him during his months there, describing the experience as feeling almost like being adopted as a local, and comparing the warmth of Belfast to that of his own hometown of Glasgow. That local embrace occasionally became a bit more chaotic than he expected. In one particularly memorable story Butler has shared in interviews, he decided to visit what he assumed would be a quiet, low-key pub, reasoning that an older, more traditional establishment would be unlikely to cause much of a stir. Almost immediately upon walking in, however, several patrons recognized him, and within minutes word had spread through the bar, with a growing crowd of increasingly excited and increasingly intoxicated locals moving toward him all at once. The situation escalated quickly enough that staff members at the pub ended up gently steering Butler and his manager back out the door for their own safety, a moment Butler has since recounted with obvious amusement, laughing about how confidently he had assured his manager beforehand that this particular pub would be completely low-key and free of any fuss. Nick Frost, who plays Gabber, developed his own deep affection for Belfast during the shoot, though his appreciation leaned toward a slightly different kind of local charm. An enthusiastic admirer of engineering and industrial history, Frost has spoken about how much he enjoyed being able to see the massive Harland and Wolff shipyard cranes, iconic structures overlooking the city that are visible from much of the area where filming took place. He has described feeling genuinely delighted to be shooting so close to that kind of engineering history, calling the experience incredible for someone with his particular interests. When asked about the prospect of returning to Northern Ireland for a sequel, Frost offered a characteristically dry response, joking that his real preference would be for the production to simply build a small set somewhere near his own house so he wouldn't have to travel at all, adding with a laugh that he could probably fit a small dragon like a terrible terror somewhere on his property, but that a full-size Night Fury would likely be pushing it. The younger members of the cast, meanwhile, developed their own set of stories from their time filming in Northern Ireland, many of which reflect the particular chaos and camaraderie that comes from a large group of young actors spending months together in a remote, unfamiliar place. Mason Thames and Nico Parker have both spoken about how bitterly cold the North Coast filming locations could get, describing the conditions as freezing even while acknowledging how genuinely beautiful the scenery was around them. At one point during filming, a stretch of food poisoning swept through a significant portion of the cast and crew, an unpleasant but not uncommon hazard of location shooting in remote areas. Mason Thames, however, was one of the few people on set who managed to avoid getting sick entirely, a fact he has attributed, somewhat jokingly, to having attempted cold water swimming for the first time shortly before the outbreak, as though the shock of the icy Northern Irish Sea had somehow inoculated him against whatever was going around. He has since said that despite whatever protective effect it may have had, the experience of swimming in genuinely freezing open water was not something he had any interest in repeating, regardless of any potential health benefits. Some of the most consistently mentioned behind-the-scenes stories from the production center not around any single dramatic incident, but around the sheer difficulty the young cast had keeping a straight face while filming certain scenes together. Nico Parker has spoken at length about how difficult it was to get through takes without breaking into laughter, specifically citing the energy among the group of actors playing the young dragon trainees. She has singled out Mason Thames, Harry Trevaldwyn, Gabriel Howell, and Julian Dennison as being particularly prone to derailing scenes with humor, explaining that the entire ensemble found each other constantly funny in ways that made maintaining composure during serious dramatic beats surprisingly difficult. She has described one specific memory from filming inside the Dragon Training Arena set, recalling a moment where, between takes, the group began improvising insults directed jokingly at Mason Thames's character, essentially mocking Hiccup's presence in the arena in a way that had everyone struggling not to laugh once the cameras rolled again. Parker has said in interviews that she is honestly somewhat amazed the production managed to produce a coherent, emotionally serious film at all, given just how often takes had to be reset because someone on set, whether an actor or a crew member, had broken character laughing. This dynamic among the casts became significant enough that it directly informed some of the bonus content included with the film's home entertainment release, which featured a full gag reel specifically compiled from these moments of the cast losing their composure during production. Alongside the gag reel, the home release also included a making-of documentary detailing the construction of Burke, a feature specifically focused on the design and technological development of the dragons themselves, and a segment dedicated to the elaborate costume transformations undergone by the cast in order to convincingly become Vikings on screen. One particularly notable behind-the-scenes feature focused on the earliest stages of creating the pivotal Forbidden Friendship sequence, the scene in which Hiccup first begins to earn Toothless' trust, showing Mason Thames performing the full sequence opposite a puppeteer operating an early practical version of Toothless before digital effects were layered onto the performance in post-production. This practical puppeteer work turned out to be an essential part of how the filmmakers approached the entire film, since having a physical presence on set for Thames to actually react to, rather than performing entirely opposite an empty space that would later be filled with a computer-generated dragon, allowed for far more believable and grounded eye lines, physical interactions, and emotional reactions throughout Hiccup and Toothless scenes together. Director Dean DeBlois has spoken extensively about the challenge and reward of adapting a movie he had already made once before, describing the process as one that required a degree of emotional distance in order to work effectively. He explained that because roughly 15 years had passed since the original animated film's release, and because he generally avoids rewatching his own finished work once it has been released, he was able to approach the material with what he described as more of a sense memory of the story rather than a scene-by-scene recollection, which allowed him to revisit the script with fresh eyes and identify specific places where the live-action format offered opportunities to deepen character, relationships, or expand the underlying mythology of the world. He has spoken specifically about wanting to explore the father-son relationship between Stoic and Hiccup with more nuance and complexity than the animated film had room for, a sentiment echoed by Gerard Butler, who has said that the scenes he shared with Mason Thames exploring Stoic's fear, frustration, and eventual pride in his son were among the performances he is most proud of in the entire film. The design of the dragons themselves, and particularly Toothless, represented one of the most significant technical and creative challenges of the entire production. DeBlois has explained that the goal for most of the dragon designs was to migrate the silhouettes, coloring, and personality traits established in the animated films into a more photorealistic, naturalistic world, drawing inspiration from real animals such as crocodiles, tropical birds, and walruses to help ground the creatures in something that felt biologically plausible. Toothless presented a unique problem within this approach, since early conceptual attempts to make him more realistically panther-like risked stripping away the exaggerated, expressive qualities that made him such a beloved character in animated form. The design team ultimately found that they needed to preserve certain stylized features, particularly his oversized eyes, wide expressive mouth, and distinctive ear plates, even at the cost of strict biological realism, because those specific traits were so tied to Toothless' personality and emotional readability on screen. Not every scene filmed during production made it into the final theatrical cut, and the home release's selection of deleted scenes offers additional insight into decisions made during editing. One deleted sequence, referred to during production as the beach break scene, was meant to follow directly after the exhilarating test drive flight sequence, showing Hiccup and Toothless taking a relaxed break together, cooking fish on a quiet beach, only to be comically ambushed by a group of small dragons called Terrible Terrors attempting to steal their food. Although the scene was fully filmed, The editing team ultimately determined that it slowed the pacing of that section of the film without adding information the audience did not already understand through other scenes, leading to its removal in favor of tighter overall pacing. A second deleted scene involved a near-discovery moment in which Astrid almost catches Hiccup with Toothless late at night inside the village blacksmith stall, a charming character beat that was ultimately cut for similar pacing reasons, since the emotional information it conveyed was already being communicated elsewhere in the story. Taken together, the financial scale of the production, the physical extremity of the costumes, the logistical challenge of filming across some of the most remote and dramatic coastlines in the United Kingdom and the North Atlantic, and the constant undercurrent of laughter and camaraderie among the cast paint a picture of a production that was every bit as demanding as the finished film suggests, while also being, by nearly every account from the people who lived through it, a genuinely joyful and closely bonded experience. From Gerard Butler's unplanned pub chaos in Belfast to Nick Frost's admiration of shipyard cranes to Mason Thames's ill-advised cold water swim to an entire cast of young actors who apparently could not stop making each other laugh long enough to finish a single take, the making of How to Train Your Dragon stands as proof that even the most technically ambitious blockbuster productions are, underneath all the budgets and logistics, still built on the relationships and shared experiences of the people who show up to make them. If you loved learning what really went on behind the scenes of How to Train Your Dragon, from the staggering budget to the chaos and laughter on set, do not forget to like this video, share it with fellow fans of the franchise, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next deep dive into how your favorite films actually get made. How to Train Your Dragon Cultural and Historical Analysis. Beneath its spectacle of flying dragons and windswept Viking villages, How to Train Your Dragon carries a surprisingly rich layer of cultural and historical texture, one that blends genuine elements of Norse history and mythology with deliberate creative liberties designed to serve a modern, universal story rather than a strict historical record. Understanding where the film draws from real Viking culture, where it deliberately departs from it, and what deeper cultural conversations it has sparked over the years reveals just how much thought went into building the world of Berk, both in its original animated form and in this live-action reimagining. The world of Berk is explicitly framed as existing during the Viking Age, the historical period stretching roughly from the late 8th century to the early 11th century, during which seafaring Scandinavian warriors and traders launched voyages across much of Europe, raiding coastal settlements, establishing trade routes, and eventually settling in regions as far-reaching as the British Isles, Iceland, Greenland, and parts of North America. The film never assigns Berk a precise year or a specific geographic location on a real map, and this vagueness is intentional, allowing the story to draw freely on the general aesthetic and cultural touchstones of the Viking Age without being bound to the accuracy of any single historical moment or region. This fictional flexibility traces back to the origins of the source material itself. The franchise is based on a series of books written by British author Cressida Cowell, who has spoken about how the idea for the story first came to her during childhood holidays spent on a remote, largely uninhabited island off the west coast of Scotland, a place she has described as sparking her early fascination with the idea that dragons might have once lived there. That particular stretch of coastline was historically well traveled by Viking voyagers during the era of Norse expansion, and Cowell wove details of authentic Viking culture and Norse mythology into her books to create a world that felt textured and believable even though it remained, at its heart, a work of fantasy for young readers. One of the most immediately noticeable ways the film blends historical texture with popular imagination is through its visual depiction of the Vikings themselves, particularly the now iconic image of horned helmets. This is one of the most widely recognized visual shorthand symbols associated with Vikings in modern popular culture, and it appears throughout Berk in various forms, yet actual historical Vikings did not wear helmets with horns attached to them in battle. Surviving archaeological evidence from the Viking Age shows helmets that were simple, practical, and unadorned, designed for protection rather than intimidation or decoration. The horned helmet image actually traces back much later, to 19th century opera productions, particularly costume designs created for Wagnerian stagings of Norse-inspired mythological operas, which then filtered into popular illustrations, advertising, and eventually film and television throughout the 20th century until the image became permanently and inaccurately fused with the popular idea of what a Viking looked like. The filmmakers behind How to Train Your Dragon have been open about the fact that this was a deliberate, informed creative choice rather than an accident born of ignorance, opting to lean into the popular, recognizable version of Viking iconography that audiences already associate with the culture, since the goal of the film was never to serve as a historically rigorous document, but rather to use familiar, evocative imagery in service of an entertaining and emotionally resonant story. A similar logic applies to many of the other stylized elements of Burke's Viking culture, including the broad Scottish inflected accents used by most of the cast, which stand in for a general sense of rugged, weathered toughness rather than any genuine linguistic connection to the historical Old Norse language actually spoken by real Viking Age Scandinavians. Gerard Butler's own natural Scottish heritage as a Paisley-born actor lent an added layer of authenticity to this stylistic choice when he originally voiced Stoic in the animated films, and that same vocal texture carries directly into his live-action performance, reinforcing a Viking identity built more around cultural association and audience familiarity than strict linguistic accuracy. Despite these deliberate departures from historical fact, several elements of the film's portrayal of Viking material culture are rooted in real historical practice. The prominence of round wooden shields throughout Burke reflects genuine Viking-age military equipment, where shields were treasured, practical, and often decorated with meaningful imagery, valued highly enough that surviving Norse poetry includes verses specifically composed in praise of particularly fine shields. The blacksmithing culture depicted through Gabba's forge, the longhouse-style architecture of the village dwellings, and the emphasis on seafaring, craftsmanship, and communal village life all draw, at least in general spirit, from real patterns of Viking-age Scandinavian settlement and daily life, even if the specific visual details have been simplified, exaggerated, or stylized for cinematic clarity and audience accessibility. The mythological dimension of the film runs just as deep as its historical influences, drawing heavily on the broader tradition of Norse mythology that has shaped so much of Western popular culture, from the Marvel adaptations of Thor, Odin, and Loki to countless other stories inspired by the Norse pantheon. Norse mythology itself emerged from the same cultural and historical period the film draws its aesthetic from, developing over centuries among the same seafaring Scandinavian societies who formed the basis for Burke's Viking population. Dragons themselves, while not a literal feature of documented Viking Age life, occupy an important symbolic place within Norse mythology and the broader folklore of Northern Europe, appearing in sagas and legendary tales as powerful, often dangerous creatures associated with treasure, wisdom, and destruction. The film's imaginative reinterpretation of dragons as an entire ecosystem of distinct species, each with unique behaviors, abilities, and personalities, represents a significant creative expansion beyond traditional dragon mythology, transforming dragons from isolated legendary monsters into something closer to an entire class of exotic, intelligent animals worthy of study, understanding, and eventually companionship, a conceptual shift that forms the entire emotional and thematic backbone of the story. This reimagining of dragons as creatures to be understood rather than simply feared connects directly to one of the film's most significant and most frequently discussed thematic elements, its handling of disability and physical difference. A thread that runs through the story with a level of care that has earned its sustained attention from disability advocates and scholars in the years since the original animated film's release. At the heart of this thematic layer is the relationship between Hiccup and Toothless, two characters who are each, over the course of the story, transformed into amputees. Toothless loses half of his tail fin as a direct result of Hiccup's own actions during the opening dragon raid, an injury that leaves him grounded and unable to fly under his own power. Hiccup, in turn, loses part of his own leg during the climactic battle against the massive dragon at the heart of the nest, a moment of sacrifice that mirrors and deepens the injury he originally caused Toothless. What makes this dynamic particularly notable from a cultural and representational standpoint is the way the story frames these injuries not as tragedies to be pitted or overcome through miraculous cure, but as challenges addressed through ingenuity, mutual support, and adaptive technology. Hiccup's construction of a prosthetic tail fin for Toothless, which allows the dragon to fly again so long as Hiccup guides the mechanism from the saddle, creates a literal physical interdependence between the two characters, one that mirrors real relationships between disabled individuals and the adaptive technology, caregivers, or companions who help them navigate a world not originally built with their needs in mind. This creative choice was reportedly not without some internal debate during the development of the original animated film, given the complicated history of physical disability being used symbolically in animated storytelling, sometimes even as a signal of villainy or menace, as seen in classic examples like Captain Hook's hook hand standing in for danger and moral corruption in earlier animated films. Aware of this troubling history, the filmmakers tested the idea of giving Hiccup a permanent physical disability with focus groups before finalizing the decision, and according to director Dean Debois, the response was notably positive, with audience members actively defending the choice to keep Hiccup's amputation in the story rather than reversing it through a more conventional, tidy resolution. This decision has continued to resonate strongly within the disability community in the years since, with numerous amputees, prosthetic users, and disability advocates specifically citing the franchise as a rare example of mainstream family entertainment that treats physical disability as a normal, manageable part of a character's ongoing life rather than a problem to be magically solved or a burden defined by tragedy. The films go further still by including a third significant character with limb loss in Gobba the Belch, whose missing hand and leg are the result of earlier dragon encounters, and who is shown throughout the franchise using a range of different interchangeable prosthetic attachments depending on the task at hand, whether that means a hook for grip, a specialized tool for blacksmithing, or other adaptive fittings. A detail that some prosthetic specialists in the disability community have specifically praised for its functional realism, even within an otherwise fantastical story. This care extends into the emotional register of the story as well. In the original film, Hiccup's disability is treated with a matter-of-fact tone rather than being surrounded by dramatic emphasis or excessive sentimentality, with the character adjusting to life with a prosthetic leg largely off-screen and returning to daily village life with the same wit and self-deprecating humor that defined him before his injury. This tonal choice, treating a major physical change as simply another part of ongoing life rather than the emotional climax of the story, has been cited by disability commentators as a particularly refreshing departure from the way physical difference is often handled in mainstream media, where disability frequently becomes either the sole defining trait of a character or the subject of an overwrought inspirational narrative arc. Toothless' own experience of disability carries additional symbolic weight, since prior to receiving his prosthetic tail, he is shown as entirely dependent on Hiccup for basic mobility and survival, unable to hunt for his own food or escape the cove where he is trapped, a narrative choice that some cultural critics have read as reflecting real and sometimes uncomfortable societal assumptions about disabled dependency, while also using that same vulnerability as the emotional foundation upon which the entire friendship between the two characters is built. Beyond its handling of disability, the story of How to Train Your Dragon carries a broader thematic architecture built around ideas of otherness, misunderstood identity, and the courage required to challenge inherited tradition, themes that have made the franchise resonate with an unusually wide range of audiences well beyond its intended family demographic. Hiccup's central conflict, the tension between who his father and his community expect him to become and who he actually is, has been widely interpreted as a broadly applicable metaphor for anyone who has ever felt fundamentally out of step with the expectations of their family, culture, or community, whether that experience relates to personality, physical ability, sexuality, neurodivergence, or simply a mismatch between individual temperament and inherited tradition. Hiccup's success ultimately comes not from suppressing his differences in order to conform to Burke's rigid warrior culture, but from leaning fully into his natural inclinations toward curiosity, empathy, and inventive problem-solving. Qualities that are initially treated as weaknesses by his community but are ultimately revealed to be exactly what the village needs in order to break its generations-long cycle of violence. This narrative structure, in which the very traits that make a protagonist feel like an outsider become the key to solving a problem that brute strength and tradition alone could never fix, has become one of the most frequently cited reasons for the franchise's broad and enduring emotional resonance across different types of audiences and cultural contexts. The film's central antagonist, the massive dragon revealed to be controlling the smaller dragons and forcing them into a cycle of raiding through fear, has also drawn interest from cultural commentators for its symbolic resonance. Some analyses of the franchise have noted the thematic echo between the destructive, disease-like menace this creature represents and the broader medieval trope of plague and pestilence as unseen, overwhelming forces beyond the control of any individual warrior, regardless of strength or bravery. A reading that fits neatly within the film's larger argument that Burke's generations of violence were never actually solving the true, underlying problem, since the Vikings had spent centuries fighting the wrong enemy entirely, treating symptoms rather than addressing the actual root cause of their suffering. This structural twist, in which the apparent enemy turns out to be a fellow victim of a larger, shared threat, reinforces the film's broader message about the danger of inherited assumptions and the importance of curiosity and direct understanding over accepted tradition passed down without question. The father-son relationship between Hiccup and Stoic carries its own significant cultural weight within the story, reflecting broader universal tensions around masculinity, legacy, and generational expectation that extend well beyond any specifically Viking cultural context. Stoic's vision of Viking manhood is built entirely around physical strength, fearlessness, and combat prowess, values that made sense within the survival-driven, constantly embattled world of Burke as the film presents it, but which leave no room for a son whose gifts lie in observation, empathy, and mechanical ingenuity rather than brute force. The eventual reconciliation between father and son, in which Stoic comes to recognize that his son's unconventional strengths ultimately saved the entire village in a way that generations of traditional warriors never could, offers a culturally resonant statement about the need for definitions of strength, leadership, and worth to expand and evolve alongside changing circumstances, rather than remaining rigidly fixed to inherited models of the past. This live-action adaptation, in returning to explore this relationship with additional depth and nuance, allows both Gerard Butler and Mason Thames the space to dig further into the emotional complexity of that dynamic, portraying not simply a battle of wills between father and son but a more layered picture of fear, love, disappointment, and eventual pride that many audiences, regardless of cultural background, have found deeply relatable. Gender dynamics within the world of Burke offer another layer worth examining, particularly through the character of Astrid, who exists within a Viking society where women fight, train, and compete alongside men without any of the story's internal logic treating this as remarkable or unusual. This choice reflects the deliberate, if not strictly historically verified, storytelling decision to present Burke as an egalitarian warrior culture where combat capability and social standing are determined by individual skill and courage rather than gender. A portrayal that scholars examining the franchise's use of medieval and Viking-inspired aesthetics have noted stands in contrast to many other historically inspired media franchises that default to strictly gendered social hierarchies simply because they are assumed to be historically accurate. While there is legitimate historical debate among archaeologists and historians regarding the extent to which women in actual Viking Age society took part in armed combat, the film's choice to present a fully integrated warrior culture reflects a broader, intentional modernization of medieval storytelling conventions. using the setting as a foundation for a more contemporary set of social values rather than attempting to strictly replicate the gender dynamics of any specific historical reality. Taken together, these layers of historical texture, mythological inspiration, and carefully considered thematic choices around disability, identity, and generational conflict reveal a franchise that has always been far more interested in using its Viking and dragon-filled setting as a vehicle for universal, emotionally resonant storytelling than in serving as any kind of rigorous historical document. The live-action adaptation continues this same tradition, translating the same blend of stylized medievalism, mythological imagination, and quietly progressive thematic choices into a new visual medium, while preserving the emotional and cultural core that has made the franchise resonate so consistently across generations of audiences since the original animated film's release in 2010. Whether viewed through the lens of Norse historical inspiration, disability representation, or universal coming-of-age storytelling, How to Train Your Dragon continues to demonstrate how a fantastical, historically loose setting can still carry genuine cultural weight and meaning, offering audiences far more to think about beneath its surface than the simple story of a boy and his dragon might initially suggest. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the real history, mythology, and cultural meaning hidden inside How to Train Your Dragon, do not forget to like this video, share it with fellow fans who love digging beneath the surface of their favorite films, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next cultural breakdown of the movies you love.